möchte ganz kurz warnen, ab hier geht das Rabbit Hole. Ab hier geht das Rabbit Hole down. Ab hier erst. Dieses Video, What the Internet Did to Garfield, habe ich vor einigen Monaten mal gesehen. Und ich wollte es seitdem euch immer wieder zeigen. Damals habe ich, glaube ich, noch gar keine Reacts gemacht, aber ich fand das Video so krass, dass ich es unbedingt im Stream gucken wollte. Das Video geht 1 Stunde, aber diese Stunde wird sich lohnen. Vertraut mir, euer Leben wird danach nicht mehr dasselbe sein. Ja, ihr müsst mir da wirklich mal, ihr müsst mir mal vertrauen, dieses Video wird euren Horizont erweitern, aber nicht unbedingt euren Lebenswillen. Ich weiß nicht, wie ich das formulieren soll, aber es ist wirklich krass. Ganz kurz Vorgeschichte, als Kind immer Garfield gelesen, ja. Als ich klein war, gab es kein Internet, ja, ihr wisst, und ich hatte kein Geld, also bin ich immer in die Buchhandlung meines Vertrauens gegangen, damals im City Point in Braunschweig. Da gab es noch den City Point und da gab es oben Salzmann, so ein Laden für Zeitschriften, und die hatten eine Bank. Und dann habe ich da immer gesessen und Comics gelesen. Ich habe da alle Clever und Smart Hefte gelesen. Ich habe Asterix da gelesen, ohne zu bezahlen natürlich. Und ich habe Schule geschwänzt und dann habe ich immer Garfield gelesen. Die hatten so ein ganz komisches Format, diese Garfield-Hefte. Deswegen bin ich irgendwann mal wieder drüber gestolpert und dann bin ich über dieses Video gestolpert. Und seitdem, es ist eines dieser seltenen Videos. Let's go, wir gehen mal rein.
Garfield is a daily newspaper comic strip starring the iconic orange cat of the same name, as well as his owner, John Arbuckle. Relatable, surly, and adorable, Garfield was based off the childhood memories of his creator, Jim Davis. And in the 40 years since we...
Merkt man da schon einen gewissen Vibe irgendwie, in welche Richtung sich das entwickeln könnte? Ich bin unsicher. Ich bin einfach unsicher. Also ich weiß noch nicht.
First met this lasagna-loving rascal, Garfield has become a global phenomenon, with yearly merchandising sales at an estimated...
The world is going to end.
I've been covering fandoms for a little while now, and what I enjoy about doing this is how when you...
Gibt's deutsche Untertitel? Leute, ich guck mal ganz kurz. Ja, ich glaube, ich bin mir nicht sicher, Englisch automatisch erzeugt, es gibt keine deutschen. Ihr müsst lesestark sein. So, ich glaube, die Bilder sprechen für sich. Ich glaube, ich muss es euch nicht übersetzen, die Bilder sprechen für sich. Ich glaube, die Bilder könnt ihr rezeptorisch wahrnehmen.
Stare at a fandom long enough, you begin to get this very distorted yet very honest reflection of its source material. The heart of the Simpsons, the descent of Sonic, the magnitude.
Auf automatisch übersetzen klicken. Gut, ach Leute, warum auf Armenisch? Ich mache automatisch übersetzen, wir gucken mal, was dabei rauskommt. Mal gucken. So.
Of Undertale, but then there's Garfield. Believe me when I say, what Garfield has become on the Internet...
Ihr solltet wirklich Englisch lernen. Nicht böse gemeint. Ja, und nicht von oben herab oder so, aber ich glaube, es ist nicht so unwichtig.
...is the most bizarre fandom I've ever encountered. And I'm not even talking about Garfield porn here, although, yes, there is totally that as well. And yes, I did have to fuck up my Google Analytics to find these. No,
das habe ich
I'm
vergessen.
talking about things far more bizarre, which, if you are not aware of, allow me to give you a little preview. R/Alzheimer's Group is a subreddit of 50,000 people reposting the same Garfield comic over and over and over. Each member role-playing like this is the first time they've seen it. Relax John is an 8-part animated series in which a morbidly depressed John Arbuckle is dragged into a frightening alternate reality as he is subsumed by a demonic Garfield.
Aber Hand aufs Herz, das sieht so krass aus. Das sieht so gut aus.
I'm sorry, John. Actually, Jesus, no, we're not ready for... I'm sorry, John. But maybe in like an hour. And maybe you've noticed the runtime for this video and are asking, how could I possibly spend this much time on an idea that the subtle lowering of my father's eyebrows as I explained it to him communicated to me was something he considered a profound waste of time.
Hä? Was?
Oh God, I was
Etwas im Internet ist Zeitverschwendung, ganz neues Konzept.
I was meant to make a video about Berserk this year.
Oh, cool. Das kenne ich noch gar nicht.
I got lost. Lost in Garfield.
Aber ich glaube, Garfield ist
But the
blutiger.
answer is I have looked deep into Garfield and I have seen things horrible, frightening, and beautiful, including what is to me, and I'm serious here, the greatest piece of fan art ever created. And I would like to show it all to you. So join me on this long and strange journey as we take our first step and ask a question. How the fuck did we get here from a cartoon cat who likes lasagna? Or, to put it another way, what is Garfield?
So, I
Eine
want to be
Illusion.
honest here, in that unlike the other fandoms I've covered for this channel, I've never really been that into Garfield.
Ich möchte ganz kurz anmerken, die automatische Übersetzung ist echt gut geworden. Über die Jahre. Die ist echt sehr viel besser geworden. Ich habe die schon seit 1000 Jahren nicht mehr gesehen. Als ich das letzte Mal benutzt habe, standen da sehr wilde Sachen. Eigentlich eher sehr lustige Sachen. Deswegen bin ich ja gar nicht mehr drauf gekommen, die zu benutzen. Also die ist inzwischen echt Respekt. Garfield ist auch ein SCP? Was? Das wusste ich gar nicht.
I've covered for this channel,
Okay, krass.
I've never really been that into Garfield. That's not to say I dislike Garfield, it's just no, I'm not doing this. I do not need to humiliate myself for your amusement. That's not to say I dislike Garfield, just that I was never really into him as a kid and that hadn't changed up until this video. And so my first call was to go looking for articles on the appeal of Garfield. But what I found...
Ich muss dazu sagen, wie gesagt, ich habe die Vorgeschichte erzählt, ich habe früher mal gerne Garfield gelesen, aber das ist nicht gut gealtert. Ich habe mir irgendwann nochmal Garfield-Comics durchgelesen und ich fand die alle wirklich, wirklich semi-lustig. Also die waren alle eher so, ja, aha. Kennst du das, wie so, wenn du so einen Comic liest und dann du blätterst durch, du konsumierst das irgendwie, das ist wie so eine Timeline bei X oder, ne, also Twitter, oder irgendwas, so eine endlose Timeline aus Comics in dem Ding und du blätterst einfach und irgendwie so. Und manchmal hast du, das ist wie so ein altes TikTok. Wie damals TikTok, du blätterst durch und manchmal hast du so einen Strip so, kurz mal die Lache und dann blätterst du wieder weiter und liest weiter diese ganzen belanglosen, ja, so wie Häger weiß ich gar nicht mehr. Aber ich weiß das nur bei Garfield. Garfield ist für mich nicht gut gealtert. Als Kind habe ich die sau gerne gelesen. Sau gerne. Und jetzt als Erwachsener, ich weiß nicht mehr warum. Ich habe keine Ahnung. Nee, der Horde-Comic ist super. Nein, den Horde-Comic lese ich gerne als Erwachsener. Als Kind darfst du ihn eh nicht lesen. Weil der dafür viel zu blutig ist und brutal und keine Ahnung, was da passiert. Ja.
was kind of the opposite.
Ist clever und smart gut gealtert? Jein. Politisch gesehen nicht so sehr, ja. Ist politisch nicht so korrekt, aber die machen beim Lesen immer noch Spaß, wenn man die sieht. Oder vielleicht, wenn da einfach eine Wurst im Bild hängt oder der ganze random Shit. Ja, aber ich muss zugeben, vieles fand ich als Kind einfach da lustiger. Muss ich zugeben. Aber vielleicht liegt es auch einfach, weiß ich nicht, keine Ahnung. Vielleicht ist mein Humor hat sich auch einfach ein bisschen geändert. Ist, glaube ich, ein bisschen, weiß nicht, ob der düsterer geworden ist, das weiß ich nicht genau. Kann ich nicht sagen.
Headlines and videos about how Garfield is not funny and even was never meant to be. How Jim Davis is a marketing man first and the comic was just intended as a vessel to sell merchandise. And after reading a lot of Garfield, and trust me, I read a lot of Garfield, I actually disagree. I think this is a fairly cynical mischaracterization of Jim Davis and can be traced back to a single quote he gave 40 years ago and is not really reflective of the dude of whom I have watched and read many, many interviews, who is the kind of person who still talks about wanting to make the whole world laugh.
Das war süß. Das finde ich
But
schon
if I'm
sehr
right
süß.
about this, then why do so many people find Garfield unfunny? And that being the case, how has it survived for 40 years?
Siehe Simpsons. Die Simpsons die ersten Staffeln waren richtig gut, waren richtig strong. Damals haben sich die Simpsons immer über Popkultur lustig gemacht und so, ne, über alles Mögliche aus der Popkultur. Und dann sind sie selber zur Popkultur geworden. Und seitdem laufen die Simpsons einfach immer durch. Sind einfach so. South Park leider auch. South Park leider. Oh, die neuen Staffeln South Park. Die Corona-Folgen fand ich cool. Die beiden Corona-Folgen, die waren bei South Park noch ganz cool. Aber South Park hat auch so ein Downgrade hingelegt. Puh. Leider. SpongeBob weiß ich nicht, da war ich irgendwann raus. SpongeBob habe ich früher ganz gerne geguckt, aber inzwischen ist SpongeBob, glaube ich, auch nur noch viel random Shit größtenteils. Family Guy leider auch, ja. Family Guy ist irgendwann auch nur noch völlig. Ich find, man sollte dann irgendwie. Ich meine, wenn die Zahlen stimmen, kann man es natürlich laufen lassen, klar, ich verstehe es. Aber ich glaube, vielleicht sollte man irgendwann sagen, ja, wir machen nur 3, 4 Staffeln und dann überlegen wir uns was Neues. So, weiß ich nicht. Wenn Serien zu lang laufen, ja. Du hast SpongeBob geguckt? Ja, sicher, klar. Ich meine, wer nicht? Ja, genau. SpongeBob ist nur noch ekel und übertrieben brutal. Genau. Und früher war es halt wirklich, war viel Wortwitz dabei und viel Selbstironie und sowas halt. Und das ist irgendwann einfach alles komplett weg gewesen. Und die Charaktere waren irgendwie alle nur noch komplett überzeichnet und waren nur noch da, um sich selbst darzustellen, irgendwie gefühlt. Ich weiß nicht. Die neueren Folgen von South Park sind besser geworden. Ja, müsste ich vielleicht mal wieder reingucken. Ich weiß nicht. Hab irgendwann aufgehört, das zu gucken. Ich habe dann die beiden Corona-Folgen gesehen. Die fand ich ganz gut. Und ich weiß, neue Staffel gab es dann auch irgendwann. Da müsste ich vielleicht mal wieder reingehen.
I'm about to be very generous with my interpretation of Garfield, but I think it's important to do that because we need to understand the appeal here. And while I am not going to defend the comedy in Garfield, as we shall see later, I find 0.104% of Garfield comics funny. I do think, however, it's worth looking at the reasons why Garfield's humor gets such a polarizing reaction from people. Jim Davis's previous comic.
Aber wir müssen natürlich dazu sagen, Humor ist subjektiv. Leute haben bestimmt auch bei meinen Let's Plays auch das Gefühl, so zum Beispiel. Ja, oder bei egal was, oder bei Julian Bions Witzen, ja. Humor ist immer subjektiv. Never trust a smiling cat. Das ist so, ja.
Garfield's humor gets such a polarizing reaction from people. Jim Davis's previous comic before Garfield was Norm the Gnat, which ended in 1975. He then spent 3 years doing, well, nothing.
Norm Gnat.
Before beginning Garfield in 1978. And to give that date a little context, that is not this decade, or the one before that, 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 but the one before that. Barring the old gods of media like Mickey Mouse and Peanuts, Garfield has been around longer than practically any relevant character in pop culture today. And you can imagine this lazy, rude, anti-authority
Das ist aber halt auch krass. Wie lange gibt's den schon? Seit den 60ern oder was? Und wirklich halt früher in der Tageszeitung tägliche, war das täglich? Ich weiß gar nicht mehr, aber immer wieder Comicstrips und bla bla bla. Und Garfield kennt halt wirklich, das muss man auch mal sagen, kennt wirklich jeder. Und wenn jetzt jemand schreibt, ich kenne Garfield nicht, dann lügt der einfach. Aber Garfield kennt man aber seit 1978, heilige Scheiße. Aber überleg mal, der Zeichner macht den seit 45 Jahren. Seit 45 Jahren. Der zeichnet seit 45 Jahren Garfield und seit 45 Jahren kommt da immer weiter Content raus.
Being a little more outrageous in the late 70s than he is today. In the same way The Simpsons and Sonic the Hedgehog would have seemed wild and countercultural in their day before it's slowly becoming mainstream, that's exactly what happened to Garfield. We are just not old enough to remember it. And Jim Davis has even talked about this in interviews. That said, I don't think the appeal of Garfield is its humor. I think it's Garfield. And what I mean by this is that we all want to be Garfield.
Montage hassen, den ganzen Tag nur rumliegen und fressen. Das sind jetzt eigentlich ganz gute Trades. Also da sehe ich mich schon ein bisschen, ne? Das, ganz ehrlich, würde ich machen. Ja, ab und zu mal den Postboten eine rein, obwohl, jetzt möchte ich nicht machen, weil der Postbote ist super. Den Hund treten möchte ich auch nicht. Ich möchte auch nicht, oh Gott, wie hieß diese weibliche Katze nochmal? Arabella? Nee, oh Gott, habe ich vergessen. Die würde ich auch nicht daten wollen, aber rumliegen und fressen und den ganzen Tag. Nee, Nürmel war die kleine, Nürmel war die niedlichste Katze. Es gab aber noch die andere weibliche. Arlene, ja, danke schön, Arlene, die mit dem Lippenstift. Das war mal die mit dem Lippenstift. Das war, genau. Es ist Montag, meine Kater. Schön. Sehr, sehr schön.
Please don't click off the video. I promise I have a point to make here. Think of everything you consider imperfect about yourself. Physical, mental, emotional, whatever. Any perceived flaw that makes you feel shame. Now, imagine an alternate version of yourself where those flaws still existed, but you just accepted them. You are in perfect harmony with who and what you are, and that's it. And well, that's Garfield. Garfield is lazy, he's gluttonous, he's selfish, and people constantly make fun of him for being fat. But he doesn't give a shit. He is perfectly content in who and what he is, and any of his perceived flaws are other people's problems, not his.
Seine wahrgenommenen Fehler sind die Probleme anderer Leute, nicht seine. Ich bin ganz ehrlich, das ist ein Satz, den möchte ich mir gerne mal in meinem Gehirn rauskopieren. Wenn Leute sagen, du wirst grau, du bist alt, ja, du bist fett, deine Fingernägel sind zu lang, ist nicht mein Problem. Ich bin happy, so wie es ist. Ich schneide dir schon, wenn ich will. Ich färbe mir die Haare, wenn ich das will. Vielleicht kann ich ja abnehmen, wenn ich will. Vielleicht will ich es aber gar nicht. Vielleicht bin ich eigentlich ganz zufrieden, wenn ich mein Gewicht so halte. Vielleicht ist es aber dein Problem. Eigentlich voll geil. Der Fehler liegt bei dir, nicht bei mir. Ist dein Fehler. Geil. Das gefällt mir eigentlich. Ehrlich gesagt finde ich das eine sehr geile Lebenseinstellung. Ich glaube, ich möchte von diesem Satz in diesem merkwürdigen Video, wo diese Weisheit auf einmal auftaucht, möchte ich aber davon profitieren. Und wenn Pan es sagt, was dann? Nö, macht's ja nicht. Die Pan liebt mich so, wie ich bin. Und die kennt meine Fehler, wenn jemand meine Fehler kennt, dann Pan. Und trotzdem ist sie nicht weggerannt. Und meine ganz komischen Eigenarten. Ist ein Du-Problem. Ja, genau. Das stimmt. Das ist geil. Ich find das sehr, sehr gut. Ich glaube, das möchte ich mitnehmen.
And that is some seriously aspirational levels of confidence. But the real genius of the character is he also has all these little traits that allow us to see ourselves in him. Garfield hates Mondays. He likes coffee. He loves lasagna. He dislikes spiders, loves to sleep, and resents authority. These are all very general, but what that means is that no matter who you are, there's probably something in Garfield you're going to be able to relate to. And that relatability, combined with his more aspirational quality, creates this simple but massively appealing cocktail of a character. And I think it's the strength of that appeal that's let Garfield survive for 40 years. And I just want to note here that for as messed up as things are going to get this video, there is
auch voll
a
cool aus der
lot of
Zeichenstil.
really cool and wholesome Garfield fan art from people who just earnestly enjoy Garfield's
Voll die
comic
coolen
and
Fanarts.
his world. One standout being the fan comic John, which tells the story of an older John Arbuckle rediscovering his love of art and cartooning, and it's just this super cute and endearing take on these characters. Now, granted, you don't have to spend that long looking for Garfield fan art on the internet before things start to get strange, like Garfamon, a blog in which one intrepid Garfield
Ich weiß nicht, warum ich finde den jetzt. Oh, der ist aber auch mir. Hä? Der sieht aus wie Dingens hier von Family Guy. Hä? Garfamon, Alter, wie geil ist das denn einfach? Oh, ja, der sieht wirklich aus wie Stewie. Ich wollte gerade Steven sagen, ich weiß nicht warum. Aber Alter, ich weiß nicht warum, aber der. So.
artist has been
Das ist ein Pokémon? Nein, das ist ein Garfamon.
drawing the entirety of Pokemon as Garfield, and I don't know how many there are because my browser crashes before I hit Gen 1. But what I think's really interesting about Garfamon is it shows how iconic and malleable Garfield's visual design is. Meaning Garfield's visual design is recognizable enough to be twisted into basically
Gottes Willen ist die Couch hässlich. Aber, und das muss man auch sagen, ich glaube, ich kenne nichts, von dem es so viel Merch gibt wie Garfield. Ich kenne nichts, von dem es so viel Merch gibt wie Garfield. Es ist unfassbar, was alles mit Garfield verkauft wurde. Alles, glaube ich. Ich kann random irgendwas sagen, Klopapier. Irgendwas, Bleistifte, irgendwas. Es gibt alles mit Garfield. Ich sage sogar schlimmer als Hello Kitty. Also schlimmer als bei Hello Kitty. Ich sage sogar zweimal um die Tragweite. Ja? Aber wirklich, mit Garfield gibt es ungefähr alles. Aber man nimmt es nicht wahr. Es ist da draußen, aber man nimmt es selber nicht wahr. Oh, Creepypasta-Punch, danke für den Raid. Hallo, du kommst genau pünktlich. Du kommst genau pünktlich zu diesem sehr wichtigen Video über Garfield und du möchtest vielleicht auch ein Video darüber auf deinem Channel machen. Falls du nicht schon hast, eventuell gibt es das ja schon. Aber ja, Garfield ist ein super geiles Rabbit Hole. Super gut. Sonic gibt es auch eins, gibt noch viele mehr. Ne? Aber Garfield ist so ein geiles Rabbit Hole einfach. Da geht's gleich tiefer rein. Wir sind gerade noch ganz oben, noch ganz an der Oberfläche irgendwo. Ja. Ich habe ein Video über einen sehr verstörenden Garfield-Kanal. Ja, sehr geil. Oh, sehr, sehr gut. Das ist so cool einfach. Wir gehen aber mal weiter rein. Warte.
Anything and still read as Garfield. This will become horrifyingly relevant later. But it's not just Garfield's character design that applies to, but also the comic itself. Garfield's comic was a big part of his spread. Designed to be as simple, timeless, and consumable as possible, each one is entirely self-contained and rarely, if ever, touches off current events. And since even the early days of the internet and social media, people have been taking these comics and changing them. Something that's possible because of how simple a formula
Ich
they
weiß, was
work
gleich
off,
kommt.
with each comic following the same 3-panel structure. The first panel establishes the scenario. It is the morning and John and Garfield have just woken up. The second panel is the setup. Garfield is in an unusually good mood. And the third panel, the punchline. Garfield is in a good mood because he drinks too much coffee. With the exception of the longer Sunday comics, this is how Garfield works. And just like the character himself, that simplicity was critical in letting as wide an audience as possible understand and enjoy Garfield. But it's also that simplicity that made the comic so infinitely memeable. It is shockingly easy to make your own Garfield comic from splicing together different establishment, setup, and punchline panels. And you can even try this yourself with...
Okay, das wird echt nice. Hä? Du kannst die Bilder einfach random austauschen und es passt einfach alles. Das ist halt super nice eigentlich.
the random Garfield comic generators. And it's that malleability that's led to scores of popular online trends, such as replacing the last panel of a Garfield comic with an image of Garfield smoking a pipe, and an unusual amount of these still work.
Mom, son, Garfield. Dieting is easy when you set your mind to it. I no longer crave food. Garfield. Okay, das klappt halt echt sehr, sehr gut. Das klappt super geil. Life is like a poker game. If you don't win, Garfield. Hä? Okay, das ist fast ein bisschen weird.
But my personal favorite is the same, except the final panel now being Garfield being flung from a window.
Can I get you anything for breakfast, Garfield? Yeah, how about a big glass of freshly squeezed kitten juice? Eat that cookie and die? Hä? I sometimes make poor decisions. Ha, ha, ha. Hä? Wie gut ist das denn? Wie gut ist das denn? Das ist voll geil eigentlich. Aber ich feiere leider auch den letzten Frame. Ich muss zugeben, ich feiere den letzten Frame. Und ja, hier, 2 Leute schreiben gerade parallel. Lustiger als die echten Comics. Leider wahr. Das stimmt sogar. Es ist wirklich lustiger. Voll
However,
geil.
in time, people also got much weirder than that. For example, silent movie Garfield. Garfield with 1 extra beat panel. Garfish. Garfield with pixel art from that one really bad Garfield game that never released outside Japan. Garfield, but the drawing keeps getting lazier. Multiple choice Garfield. Garfield, except all the comics from 1978 are color averaged together. Real life Garfield.
Ach du heilige Scheiße, Garfield. Was?
Hä? Uncomfortably close Garfield. Garfield devolves into noise. 2 Garfields. Polarized Garfields, you get the idea. So Garfield is this iconic, appealing character communicated through this simple but infinitely consumable and recreatable medium. And I think this does go away in helping us understand the existence of something like r/Alzheimer's group. While there is something undeniably cruel about this subreddit, I'd be lying if I said I didn't think there wasn't something interesting and even a little poetic here. The idea that someone's final tether to their own reality is something as simple but recognizable as a Garfield comic strip, and the tragedy of when even that too starts to fade. However, this still doesn't take us any closer
Das Bild. Alter, wie gut das aussieht und wie furchtbar das einfach ist. Es ist einfach so gut.
to understanding why Garfield on the internet is so, you know. And I think a real easy answer
Garfield,
here
wirklich
is
so.
it's just the absurdity of making such depraved art out of something so simple and everyday. But as you may be able to tell from the remaining runtime on this video, I disagree. I think there's genuinely something darker and stranger at play here. And I'm not even talking.
Ich habe in 2007 bis 2009 diese Garfields aus Zeitungen abgeschnitten. 800 Comics. Also du kannst sagen, was du willst, aber Jim Davis hat auf jeden Fall abgeliefert. Der hat richtig abgeliefert.
Darker and stranger at play here. And I'm not even talking about the official Garfield's very occasional descent into something weirder. I'm talking about a darkness that lies at the heart of every Garfield comic strip. And to start to unravel what that is, I want to talk about the 28th of January 2008, when 27 very strange Garfield-themed videos all simultaneously appeared on a previously unknown YouTube channel. The kind of incredible thing about Lasagna Cat now is how weirdly ahead of its time it was. This was 2008 and the term meme was still years away from becoming something people actually said. And yet,
2008, das war 2 Jahre bevor ich mit YouTube angefangen habe.
Lasagna Cat made memes of Garfield comics, but then became memes of themselves before you had even finished watching the video. And what I mean by this is that each video of Lasagna Cat is broken into 3 sections. The first is a live-action recreation of a Garfield comic. The second, the actual comic on which the first section was based. And the third, and by far strangest section, would take the footage of section 1 and change it. So this Hee-haw! Would become this. Hee-haw! Music video parodies, video game references, 2008 internet humor. Lasagna Cat was taking Garfield comics and contorting them into all kinds of strange things, but tantalizingly, underneath the sheer wackiness of it all, there was what felt like a very subtle disdain towards Garfield. There was something a little grotesque and uncanny about these shrunken actors with their sagging costumes and human hands, each skit ending with the same canned droning laughter that nearly highlighted the mundanity of these jokes.
Garfield, this is a diagram of the food chain. You're here, and that's a mouse down there. Any questions?
Where's pizza?
But the strangest part was...
Besser als die Comics, was soll ich sagen? Ist leider besser als die Comics. Und irgendwie passt es wieder in die heutige Zeit. Ich weiß nicht warum.
How each video ended on a bizarre tribute to Jim Davis. This is one of the first really unusual things I noticed about the Garfield fandom. It has this kind of feverish...
Ist aus dem Comic, ich weiß, man hat den Strip ja gesehen, aber trotzdem war es als Film halt besser als Comic. Das meine ich. Warte.
I noticed about the Garfield fandom. It has this kind of feverish obsession with Garfield's creator, Jim Davis. And I say unusual because in every other fandom I've covered, I don't know if I remember a single instance of the creator of those properties ever appearing in fan works, but Garfield is different. Over and over, Davis kept materializing in fan works, often in very strange ways, and to the best of my knowledge, Lasagna Cat was the first instance of this happening. So, why? Well, if that was a question you asked in 2008, you'd be waiting a long time for an answer. After the initial upload day of Lasagna Cat, the channel would go silent. Days would become weeks, weeks would become months, and months would become years. And without a single update, Lasagna Cat began to fade into internet obscurity. Which is why it was such a shock when a full 9 years later, a new video appeared on the Lasagna Cat channel, ending with the text, Telephone Sex Survey, February 9th, 2017. This was the beginning of a strange rabbit hole of videos that led 2 weeks later to a bizarrely high production trailer that claimed if you called a toll-free number and left your name and the number of sexual partners you'd had, a Garfield web series would return. 2 weeks later,
Wie cool das aber gedreht war, ne?
just like they had 9 years ago, 11 new videos were simultaneously uploaded to Lasagna Cat. And while they were similar in format to the old videos, they were also so different. The first of the new videos begins as any typical Lasagna Cat would, parodying an old comic where Garfield steals John's pipe. But what's waiting for us at the end of the video isn't a re-splicing of the footage from section 1 that we're used to, but a man claiming that this simple Garfield comic transformed his entire existence as he obsessively analyzes every tiny part of the comic in excruciating detail, his examination gradually expanding outward to the immortal nature of art and mimetic culture and its ability to transcend humanity and even the laws of space and time. And this goes on for an entire hour, and it might just be the best video on the internet. And somehow, this was just the beginning. Whereas the original end of video skits had that charming amateur with a green screen feel, what waited for us in the third act of these videos now were shockingly high production short films that
Voll geil.
transformed simple Garfield comics into these elaborate, surreal stories. Jokes about Odie getting a bag stuck on his head morphed into these strange tales of the bag-headed Odie becoming a fashion icon before taking his own life and being condemned by Garfield to a hell filled with demonic John Arbuckle chimeras. Gags where John uses the wrong shampoo would now be mutated into, well, this is what they would turn into, and I don't want to describe this. Those
Shampoo,
simple
es ist
Garfield
Shampoo.
jokes were now being
Es ist
contorted
Shampoo.
to the
Es war
bizarrest
Shampoo.
of extremes, contrasting the
Ein Schwein, wer was anderes denkt.
the original with this just
Der Mann hat sich die Haare
wild
gewaschen, lass ihn doch.
insanity. And even more pronounced this time was that subtle malice towards Garfield. Each video still ending on those bizarre tributes to Jim Davis. But it's only in the final video ever uploaded to the channel that Lasagna Cat would reveal what it truly was. And that video was called Sex Survey Results. Sex Survey Results begins with John Arbuckle entering his living room and sitting down to...
Alter, wie aufwendig das gemacht ist, ne? Der ganze Raum mit den Bildern da dran und alles. Wie aufwendig das gemacht ist.
Sex Survey Results begins with John Arbuckle entering his living room and sitting down to read the paper. But he hears a knock on his door and...
Who's there?
To which he answers, revealing a strange white mannequin. The mannequin giving its name and number of sexual partners.
Hey, my name's Garrett Smith, and I have had exactly 0 sex partners.
Before the scene freeze frames and pulls out to reveal a near identical scene, and we begin again, but now with Garfield instead of John. The same events play out, only with a new piece of audio detailing someone else's name and number of sexual partners, and we cycle again, but now with Odie. And then again,
Wie
back
geil.
to John, and then again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and this continues for nearly 5 hours, all of which I have watched, most of which I did live on stream. Watching Sex Survey Results in its entirety is exhausting, an exercise in mind-numbing repetition. But I think there's something kind of important in that experience. You're listening to all these different recordings of people communicating what is, to many, a pretty sensitive piece of information.
Wie es am Video
And
langsam
it's
dunkel wird.
weird
Hä?
and even a little uncomfortable.
Wie die Zeit im Video auch vergeht. Alter, wie viele Details einfach.
Soon, you
Und
just
warum sieht John Arbuckle aus wie Bastian Pastewka?
go numb to it. After an hour, it stops feeling weird, and after hours, it stops feeling like anything, because anything repeated enough times loses all meaning. Not unlike a comic strip running day after day after day after day after day for 40 years. And it's at that point, when that feeling is at its strongest and you are completely numb to whatever is happening, that Lasagna Cat hits you with what has to be one of the most infamous and shocking pieces of footage that is allowed to exist on YouTube.
Ich weiß nicht, ob es das Video jetzt spoilert, das kann ich nicht sagen, ne? Also vielleicht Augen zu.
At this point, the scene has
Es hat schon
descended
nachts.
into night. The mannequins have begun to take strange and grotesque shapes, and John answers the door one final time, only to be faced with
John Arbuckle, 2. John Arbuckle, 0.
And immediately, this second John ages about 30 years. This new, older John Arbuckle now wandering the streets alone, frightened and confused. He finds a dried out husk of a cat, which teleports him to a massive ravine, where he encounters a strange naked shaman who attacks him before teleporting behind him and whispering silent words in his ear, before John collapses into a pile of worms and dirt. The shaman roars, and we hard cut to a young girl screaming in the bathroom of a public school. We're given extreme close-ups of her birthing a stillborn child, and she steps back and stares down in horror before saying something in Polish.
To dziecko nie jest moje. To dziecko jest coś z ciemności. Ja porodziłam ludzkie przekleństwo.
She leaves, and we get one final shot of the child, but now a ginger cat is perched beside it. We cut, the cat is now gone, and the baby opens its eyes before the screen is filled with a block of bright orange.
Well, that was a nightmare, but I actually think that Lasagna Cat has something really interesting to say.
Ich glaube, es war die Geburt von John. Aber was hat die Frau gesagt auf Polnisch? Das Kind ist etwas aus der Dunkelheit. Das Kind ist nicht meins, es ist die Geburt von etwas Dunklem. Und es war 100 Pro die Geburt von John Arbuckle. Heilige Scheiße. Oh.
But to get there, we're gonna have to do a little legwork. Earlier in this video, we asked, what is Garfield? But now, I would like to ask, what is Garfield?
Considering I'd had little history with Garfield, I knew to answer this, I would need to immerse myself in him, to understand the comic on an intimate level. And so, I committed to reading 400 Garfield comics. But not just that, I wished to study them. And so, I didn't just read Garfield, I collected data on Garfield.
Oh, God.
I noted every observation I had in a large Google spreadsheet.
Oh, God.
And through this, I established that Garfield was made up of roughly 11 different kinds of jokes, such as humor derived from the fact that Garfield is lazy/gluttonous, absurdist humor, relatable humor, other humor, which were either recurring jokes too sporadic for their own category.
Ich liebe Datenbanken, aber ich finde es erschütternd, dass es nur 11 verschiedene Witzarten sind.
But mainly jokes about Garfield doing things a cat would do, the joke being that he's a cat, or jokes about Garfield doing things a cat would not do, the joke being he's a cat. These are my least favorite kind of Garfield joke. I measured for a variety of other variables, such as the amount of fourth wall breaks, which was 4, or instances of Garfield becoming suicidal, which was 2, or how many times the comic made me laugh, which was precisely once. and it was this one. After many, many hours of collecting Garfield data, I sought to answer a single question that would surely help me understand Garfield and by extension, Lasagna Cat. What was the most common type of joke in Garfield? And when I tabulated the results, what I saw shook me. What was I looking at? This couldn't be possible. And I grew concerned. The 400 comics I had pulled from were a combination of every comic on the Twitter account Random Garfield, which algorithmically pulls 3 random Garfield comics every day, as well as this YouTube video ranking the top 100 Garfield comics. Perhaps this video was a mistake, its author's biases tainting my study, so I proceeded to read 200 more Garfield comics, chosen completely at random from Garfield's web archive. I tallied the numbers again and no, impossible. This time the results were even more pronounced. Was I subconsciously selecting Garfield comics to affirm my own biases? I couldn't allow this. And so I committed to reading an entire year of Garfield, each month being selected from 3 and 4 year intervals across Garfield's 4 decades, bringing my total number of read Garfield comics to 956. But then I was struck with an idea. What if I committed to reading every Garfield comic in existence? Then my data would be pure, complete, and indisputable. This is when I encountered a problem. When I sought out the estimated total number of Garfield comics in existence, that number was 14,000! But how was there that many? This video was already taking far too long, and at this point, I'd already spent several days reading Garfield comics, and yet somehow I had only consumed 6.83% of all Garfields. For not the last time this video, the very concept of Garfield began to feel gargantuan and impossible, entirely beyond the grasp of my feeble mortal consciousness. I decided that reading 14,000 Garfield comics was not a realistic goal. I know some of you will consider this a failure. I am sorry. I read up on sample sizes and learned that my current yield of Garfield comics will leave me with a margin of error of about 1.5%, and this is widely considered acceptable. I sigh and proceed forward. I tally the final numbers and rank each strain of Garfield joke from 11 to 1. The results frighten me. I am now going to share this specific breakdown with you because I need you to see what I see. Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself a question. What do you think is the most common type of joke in Garfield? And I want you to hold on to that guess as we proceed down the list. At number 11, we have jokes centered around Irma, the local cafe owner, and how she's bad at running her business. These jokes make up just 0.42% of Garfield. Just above that, at number 10, with 0.5%, were jokes based around Garfield's girlfriend Arlene. At number 9, with 1%, was humor derived from how much Garfield hates Nermal. At number 8, with 2.3%, is comedy conveying Garfield's hatred of spiders. At number 7, with 4.5%, was relatable humor. This was the first major surprise to me. I had assumed that a cat whose entire branding was built on one simple, relatable quote would have more relatable humor in its comic. I was wrong, and it wouldn't be the last time. At number 6, at 4.7%, was whimsy derived from Garfield's abuse of Odie. At number 5, with 13.7%, was mildly surreal and absurdist humor. At number 4, with 16.8%, are jokes based on Garfield being lazy or gluttonous. And again, for obvious reasons, I was shocked not to see this further up the list. At number 3, with 17.4%, is other. These are the kinds of jokes I do not like. And at number 2, with 18.8%, is a mystery category that I will reveal much later in the video for dramatic effect. Now, before I unveil number 1, I want to stop and ask you again, What do you think is the most common type of joke in Garfield?
Was denkt ihr? Was ist der meiste? So, okay, wir gehen mal rein. Okay, wir gucken mal. Alf.
Number one, and by far the biggest shock on the list, was a category I never even would have guessed existed. And it's called John is pathetic. John Arbuckle is 30 years old. He lives alone, has no real friends outside his dog and cat, and is constantly lonely. And these are all things that the Garfield comic takes joy in ridiculing. A typical John is pathetic gag works like this. John says he's not going to call women for dates anymore, that he's going to wait for them to approach him. We see him waiting, and then we see him waiting what appears to be several months later. Jokes like this are very common, not just in how women find John actively repulsive, but in how he is pathetic and should be ridiculed.
Und hat der Zeichner von der Serie, hat er sich selbst nicht gemalt als John Arbuckle? Also Jim Davis hat sich doch selbst gemalt als, ne? Er ist ja quasi, er selbst.
And you can see this in how the comic portrays his intelligence, his hobbies, his fashion sense, to even his physical strength and inadequacy in anything that could be considered remotely masculine. Across nearly 1,000 comics, I measured 0 cases of John showing any admirable qualities. Meaning, whereas Garfield is something to be aspired to, John is something to be laughed at. Even when John did find a girlfriend in Liz 28 years into Garfield's run, and only after fans begged Jim Davis to end John's loneliness, he's still treated as this pathetic character. And I think there's something kind of sad about that. A person whose only purpose is to be ridiculed and to be trapped in that existence for 40 years. And where this gets even sadder is when you start to consider the comic from John's perspective.
Ich glaube, ich weiß, worauf
Across
das
that
hinausläuft.
same range of comics, I measured 156 instances of John displaying some kind of negative emotion or mental anguish. Anger, depression, lethargy. But if you're a casual reader of the comics, it might never feel like that. As whenever John does begin to sink into despair.
Ganz kurz, um das vielleicht ein bisschen in Relation zu bringen. Das ist hier alles sehr stark zusammengefasst. Und im Grunde genommen heißt es nur, John hat verschiedene Gefühle im Laufe seines Lebens. Und ich glaube, das geht uns allen so. Wir alle sind von Mal zu Mal vielleicht traurig, vielleicht glücklich, vielleicht geben wir mal auf bei irgendwas, vielleicht macht uns irgendwas sauer. Das ist eben das Leben. Ne? Und hier ist natürlich alles sehr stark zusammengefasst. Die Sachen in Johns Leben sollte er real sein, wo er halt nicht so ist. Darüber gibt es natürlich keine Comics, weil die wären natürlich langweilig. Ja, aber das ist ansonsten ist das eher das Leben.
Garfield is there to deliver a witty punchline and diffuse the tension. But here is where we start to get into the very strange nature of reality and Garfield. See, as the audience, as the readers of this comic, we can experience Garfield's thoughts through the visual device of thought bubbles. But critically, this is not the case for John. Across every Garfield comic I read, I didn't record a single instance of John ever directly reacting to Garfield's thoughts in a way that couldn't be explained by him intuiting Garfield's body language and expression.
Jetzt kommen wir zu dem Teil, der lustig wird. Den kenne ich. Diesen Teil kenne ich. Ja.
And that information is critical because it means the reality we are experiencing and the one John is experiencing are entirely different. And this brings us to a question. What is it really like being John Arbuckle? On the 13th of February 2008, a Garfield fan comic was uploaded to Tumblr, and it looked just like a regular Garfield comic, but with one critical difference. The first panel depicted John sitting alone with the dialogue, "I've done things in my life that I regret." The second panel shows nothing, just John, his remorseful silence unbroken. The final panel of the comic punctuated by nothing. Just a slight shift in John's expression, like his regrets are washing over him. What this was just a regular Garfield strip with one key difference. Garfield had been removed. And because of the very specific way John and Garfield communicate, the comic still works. But whereas before, Garfields punchlines could distract us from Johns misery.
Das ist eine bekanntere Variante von Garfield, die kenne ich sogar, wo Garfield einfach gar nicht existiert. Und trotzdem funktionieren die Comics alle.
That's
aber auf
no
eine andere
longer
Art und Weise.
And this was the beginning
Garfield
of
without
the
Garfield.
bizarre and morbid webcomic, Garfield minus Garfield,
Ja, voll
which lets
geil.
us experience the true crushing reality of John.
Ja.
And some of these comics are really haunting. There's one in particular that is either very hopeful or very devastating, depending on your perspective, where John says, "We can't do anything about the past, but we can do something about the future," before he just disappears. Garfield minus Garfield was not the first instance of people removing Garfield from the comic to produce this kind of effect, but it was what popularized the idea online that there may be something very wrong with John Arbuckle. And over time, other fan works began to explore this in similar ways. Realistic Garfield, for example, conveyed similar themes by just replacing Garfield with a realistic cat who could not talk, as did fan comics like Arbuckle, while animations like Meat Canyon's Lasagna brought the idea of John's fractured reality even further, depicting John as a frightening, delusional lunatic who holds his terrified victims captive and forces them to play the part of Garfield and Odie, as he warps back and forth between the John Arbuckle we know from the comics and something much, much darker. The reason all these pieces are important is that they show not only that there is something kinda wrong with John Arbuckle, but also that that is something that even in the early days of Garfield's online fandom, people picked up on. But where things get even stranger is when we look at this through the lens of what John Arbuckle was originally meant to be. Remember earlier when I said that Norm Nat ended in 1975, Jim Davis then spent 3 years doing nothing, and Garfield started in 1978? Well, that was a lie. But I framed it this way because for decades, that's what people thought was the truth. Listen to any interview in which Jim Davis speaks about the origins of Garfield, and he'll wheel out the same anecdote about the failure of Norm Nat because insects are not appealing characters, and how that realization led to him looking at dog-centric comics like Peanuts and Marmaduke and saying to himself, what if I can create a similar character but for people who like cats? And thus, Garfield was born. Except this version of events also ignores the existence of Heathcliff, another surly, round, orange cat who predates Garfield by about 5 years, and this isn't relevant at all, but I just think it's funny. However, this telling is a lie, or at least not the full truth. Because you see, in the period between 1975 and 1978, there was a third comic, one that was only discovered in 2019 by intrepid Garfield historian Quentin Reviews, and this comic was simply titled John. There are two very strange things about John. The first being how closely it resembles Garfield. Everything from jokes to entire layouts are repeated across the two series, the only difference being that the main character here is John. Davis has spoken a lot about how John Arbuckle is an analog for him. Both grew up on a farm, both live in Muncie, Indiana, and both are cartoonists. In fact, Davis originally wanted to use the character of John as a way to voice his frustration with the comic strip industry, which, if you look at where Davis was in his life when he first started writing this character, that tracks. John started just 2 weeks after the failure of Norm Nat, and you can feel that frustration in these early comics. In one instance, John even turning to the camera and saying how he thinks the content of this comic will land him in trouble with parents groups. And while Garfield still featured heavily, there were strips where he just didn't appear at all. with scenarios more focused on observational humor derived from the perspective of a single man. But it wasn't long into the run when that started to change, with jokes more and more centering around Garfield and not John. The final strip of John being published on August 8th, 1977, the strip returning a week later, but now named Garfield. And within a year, Garfield would be syndicated on a national level, becoming the newer version of the comic we are all now familiar with. The second thing I find so strange about John is that while Jim Davis is often happy to laugh about the failure of Norm Nat, he barely ever speaks about John, and when he does, he only talks about it in the vaguest of terms, as if it was an idea in his sketchbook as opposed to an actual published comic.
Aber vielleicht auch deswegen, weil John im Grunde genommen war das ja schon der Garfield-Comic, aber hat sich vielleicht mehr auf John konzentriert, aber vielleicht wollten die Leute weniger John sehen und können eher mit Katzen relaten. Nicht relaten, sondern sehen einfach lieber Katzen. So, weiß ich nicht. Eventuell das.
And I can't help but wonder if there's something to that. If the idea of a comic that was meant to be his own perspective, his own outlet on life, was a failure, overtaken by a fictional character he created. Even stranger, as Garfield went on, the similarities between Jim Davis and John Arbuckle began to disappear. John's job as a cartoonist practically vanishing as he devolves into the pathetic shell of a man we now know. And I'm not saying here that I think Jim Davis has some deep-rooted trauma that is manifesting in his daily newspaper comic. I genuinely do not think that. But I do think that this perspective adds a lot to this strange meta-narrative of a man overtaken by his own creation, abandoning the character he once embodied, and that character now being trapped in a life of existential suffering.
Ja, nein. Ich kann mir aber vorstellen, dass er wirklich frustriert war eine Weile lang, hat an diesem John-Comic gemacht, hat seine Frustration in den Comics ausgedrückt und dann irgendwann ist er das ja losgeworden. Er konnte es ja loswerden, sogar öffentlich in den Zeitungen. Und ich vermute mal, diese Wut oder diese Trauer ist irgendwann ein bisschen von ihm abgefallen und dann hat er wahrscheinlich sich eher auf die Katze konzentriert oder so. Ne? Und John wurde dann eher zur Nebenfigur als zur Hauptfigur. Also ich glaube, es ist eigentlich eher was Gutes gewesen.
And here's the thing. If I was the only person who saw this, then there wouldn't be a story here. But I'm not. Let's go back to those last 5 minutes of Lasagna Cat.
Oh God.
Lasagna Cat ended 2 years before the discovery of John, but even then, what John adds to Lasagna Cat is kind of chilling. Like in that final scene, when that second John ages, he begins to bear a striking resemblance to Jim Davis, the person we now know John was originally meant to be. This new strange combination of Jim Davis and John Arbuckle, lost and clinging to the husk of a cat he should have let go of a long time
so übel
ago.
einfach. Boah, so
Before
übel.
he comes face to face with a version of Garfield that's become independent from him and is now strange and frightening. Before Davis crumbles to earth, outlived by the very thing he created, which is immediately followed by the bathroom scene. And what's interesting here is that if we translate the girl's monologue from Polish, it reads, "This child isn't mine. This child is from the darkness. I've given birth to humanity's curse. My soul will be swallowed and vomited and swallowed again.
Das heißt, sie hat wirklich John Arbuckle quasi wiedergeboren, wenn ich das richtig verstehe.
Forever. Sick joke. But no one is laughing. My blood will remain. Death isn't the end. I am in hell. This is hell." And while I can't show it on screen, in that final shot, the baby is shown wearing a blue shirt identical to John Arbuckle's. For pieces of art like this, I think there is a lot of different interpretations that you can make. But for me personally, when Lasagna Cat is taken in totality, it becomes this bizarre statement on what happens when the things you create become more powerful than you. How Garfield has become this semi-immortal entity, evolving past both John Arbuckle and Jim Davis. And I mean this literally. Garfield is no longer even created by just Jim Davis. He has an entire team of people working under him who have become so adept at creating Garfield, their work is now indistinguishable from his. And Davis has even spoken about selecting a replacement so that Garfield can continue long after he's gone.
Gibt's ja inzwischen auch 3D animiert und so weiter. Da brauchst du den John eigentlich gar nicht mehr. Den Jim.
But here's the thing. It's not just Jim Davis's reality that Garfield has had this strange effect on. It's also ours. That might sound weird. I mean, how relevant could Garfield actually be in the modern era? Well, if I was to ask you which character out of Superman, Goku, and Garfield was the most syndicated, which would you pick? And if you picked any answer other than Garfield, well, that was a strange choice given the subject of this video, but yeah, it is Garfield. After multiple decades in thousands of worldwide newspapers, Garfield has an estimated audience in the hundreds of millions. The New York Times had to change how its trade bestseller list was categorized after 7 of its 10 slots were occupied by Garfield. And today, his merchandising sales are at an estimated $800 million to $1 billion, and that is a lot to sell in 40 years. Oh, wait, that's every year? That's every fucking year! In products that twist Garfield into every conceivable form you can imagine. For example, Garfield soap, Garfield air fresheners, Garfield cushions, Garfield teapots, a poster with Garfield as a ninja, Garfield headphone holders, Garfield thermostat, Garfield commemorative coin, Garfield digital alarm clock, Garfield's key hanger, Garfield piggy bank, Garfield Walkman, Garfield globe, Garfield ice skates, Garfield boxing gloves, how to insult your friends Garfield book, Garfield web browser, Garfield amusement park ride, Garfield personal massager, a Garfield mug, another Garfield mug, a much dumber Garfield mug, a Garfield mug that is even dumber than the first dumb Garfield mug, existential Garfield, another existential Garfield, slightly too many Irish stereotype Garfield, Garfield waistcoat, unwell Garfield, Garfield gun, Satan Garfield, slime Garfield, child Garfield, illegal Garfield, another fucking Garfield mug, I don't know what this is, table Garfield, yet another table Garfield, Garfield prison tray, sex Garfield, far too large Garfield, nightmare Garfield, this horrifying bedsheet, the deeply cursed Garfield eats, What is this? Why? This Garfield jigsaw, which for some reason I can't quite pin down, puts the fear of God in me. In the mid-80s, a small coastal French village began to suffer an unusual phenomenon when plastic Garfield phones began washing up on shore. No one knew where they came from or why this was happening, but it continued for 3 decades, a mystery that was only solved in 2019 when the mysterious phones were traced back to a lost shipping container. We have so saturated this planet with Garfield merchandise that even the Earth herself has begun to reject it. But if that's the case, why don't we notice Garfield more? Why don't we see him everywhere in every day? And the answer is because they don't want us to. In the early 90s.
Jetzt fällt's mir auf, Garfield an sich ist ein Liminal Space. Garfield an sich ist überall und du siehst ihn nie. Du übersiehst ihn einfach immer. Aber der ist überall da. Garfield ist ein Liminal Space. Also Liminal Spaces, ganz kurz, sind Sachen, oder Subliminal, ich weiß nicht genau, sind Sachen, die du immer siehst. Also du nimmst sie wahr, aber du siehst sie nicht. Angenommen, du gehst jeden Tag durch einen Flur, durch irgendeinen Flur, du siehst den Flur gar nicht mehr, du nimmst ihn wahr, aber du siehst ihn gar nicht mehr, weil du bist ihn einfach so gewohnt, bla bla. Das sind so Sachen, die einfach immer da sind, aber für dich sind die einfach nicht relevant. Du übersiehst sie einfach komplett. Und Garfield ist etwas davon. Subliminal unterbewusst. Genau, ich kenne das als Subliminal Spaces, aber jetzt heißt es ja irgendwie Liminal Spaces. Ich kenne es aber noch als Subliminal Spaces irgendwie. Ich habe schon gekannt, also cool. Nee, aber Garfield ist das auf jeden Fall.
'80s, a production accident led to a Garfield plush with suction cups attached to its hands and feet. Paws Inc., the holding company for Garfield, didn't expect what was a botched product to sell well, which is why it was such a shock when the toy was so popular, it led to a wave of car break-ins where radios and purses were left behind and only the plush was stolen, sales climbing to a staggering $50 million. And what did Jim Davis and Paws Inc. do? We pulled all plush dolls off the shelves for 5 years. They didn't want Garfield to be a fad. They wanted to silently inject him into every part of our daily lives, where he could hide in plain sight, silently growing into one of the most dominant fictional characters on the planet. And here's the thing, they succeeded. What I'm about to tell you is not a joke. This is not some Space Jam 2-esque hijinks. This all happened over the course of making this video, an experience I call the Garfield phenomenon. It began in small ways. At first, I'd be watching a TV show and, oh, hey, there was Garfield. I'd look at Instagram and, my friends were posting about Garfield and, oh, a text. I guess Chris Pratt is playing Garfield in the new Garfield movie. That's strange timing. Wait, why is Toby Fox talking about Garfield? And sexy goth Garfield began trending on Twitter? I began to feel slightly uneasy, so maybe I'll just try and relax and look at some gaming news and oh, hey! I guess Garfield's the new character in that Smash Nickelodeon fighting game. Isn't that grand? I'd been watching ReZero, which I did not like very much, and someone told
Cookies wahrscheinlich, weil er so viel nach Garfield gesucht hat. Nee, es gibt, scheiße, wie hieß das Phänomen nochmal? Wenn du auf etwas achtest, dann siehst du es öfter. Dann nimmst du es mehr wahr. Wenn du nicht auf Garfield achtest, dann ist er einfach immer irgendwo zu sehen, bla, aber ist dir egal. Baader-Meinhof war das, glaube ich, ne? Genau, Baader-Meinhof. Genau. Und erst, wenn du dich damit beschäftigst und plötzlich siehst, oh krass, der ist ja auf einmal überall, dann nimmst du es wahr. Das ist, selektive Wahrnehmung. Ich sehe nirgends Garfield, to be honest. Ja, dann mal gucken, wie es demnächst so ist.
Told me that Garfield appears in the second season, which just can't be true, and what the fuck? A friend sent me a picture of a mural in an old house, and there was Garfield staring at me with what I can only describe as some kind of all-knowing contempt. I was now doing whatever I could not to think about Garfield, and I agreed to watch the first episode of the new Dexter with my partner, and...
Wow, yeah, I can only imagine. Brad wants to call him Garfield. I mean, who needs a dog?
What the fuck? What the fuck did he just say?
Everywhere I looked, I saw Garfield. But why? Why was this happening now? Well, that answer would come to me, and it did so in the form of a phone call. Hello?
Hi, son.
Oh, hey, Mom. How's it going?
John, I know you're working on your video of Garfield at the moment.
Er heißt selber John. Und zufällig hat das Gespräch mit seiner Mutter aufgenommen. Zufällig.
So, guess what? I found the picture of you with your Garfield.
Oh, Ma'am, I don't think that was me. I was never actually that into Garfield.
Aber Garfield war halt in den 90ern überall. Das war wie die Simpsons am Anfang.
So, earlier in this video, when I said that I was never into Garfield, that was true. I don't remember this. I don't remember owning this massive Garfield doll, but that is me, and that is my mom, and this happened. I just don't remember. And this is when it started to click. That when you look
For Garfield, you begin to find him everywhere, even in the past.
This is the Garfield phenomenon.
Ich hatte auch Garfields. Ich hatte so kleine Plastik-Garfields aus, ich glaube aus Ü-Eiern und so. Da gab es immer so kleine Plastik-Garfields. Die habe ich auch gesammelt. Aber auch Schlümpfe und so.
Garfield is all around us, and he always has been. We just never noticed. But my eyes are open, and now so are yours. If an alien race dug through a ruined Earth, they would think we worshipped Garfield. And they would be right. These are the 3 keys in unlocking what Garfield has become on the internet. A daily newspaper comic strip designed to be as simple and consumable as possible, but because of this becomes unintentionally malleable and recreatable, spreading edits of it online, one of which unknowingly touches off a bizarre meta-narrative of a man being overtaken by his own creation. That creation in time becoming an entity unto itself, one that has laid just outside the perception of man for 40 years and will remain there for infinitely more, transcending humanity itself.
Stimmt, der zweithäufigste Comic-Typ fehlt noch, ne?
This is the bizarre modern reality of Garfield, and now that we understand it, we may enter the world of I'm Sorry, John.
Ja!
On October 22nd, 2013, a comic was uploaded to the internet that showed John Arbuckle awaking late one night, but something is wrong. Something is very wrong. His room is bathed in an eerie orange glow, a strange material covering his walls, his furniture, and his entire home.
Ich möchte ganz kurz warnen, ab hier geht das Rabbit Hole down. Ab hier erst.
He goes downstairs to try and discover the source of this problem, and upon entering the kitchen, he sees Garfield, his cat's strange swollen head bizarrely embedded in the wall, his skin spreading outward, covering every surface of his home.
I was so hungry.
As John realizes with horror, his entire home with him in it have been ingested by Garfield.
I'm sorry, John.
This was the beginning, and in the years to follow, more and more strange and frightening depictions of Garfield would begin to appear on the internet. Comics that looked normal at first,
Garfield.
only to take disturbing turns, with Garfield often portrayed as something alien and unknowable, one of the most popular of which was 2017's Gramfell, a darkly humorous webcomic whose early pages were focused on John's depression, met by an uncaring, nihilistic Gramfell. But as the comic continued, Gramfell began to reveal to John not only the inherent unhappiness of life, but the futility of his existence as a character trapped in a webcomic, breaking John down to his core components and trapping him in strange and surreal realities over and over, at one point even transforming the very webcomic of Gramfell itself into a different series called Jan and Gram, in which John gets to live out the cute and peaceful life he's always wanted, before John is ripped from his serene dream and in the final page is forced to acknowledge that he is alone, and he always will be. What I find so fascinating about Gramfell is it's that same dynamic of John and Garfield, just brought to a cosmically nihilistic extreme. This was the core concept of what would inform everything that was to come, but notably Gramfell never felt truly frightening or disturbing because of the simple pastel cuteness of its aesthetic. And if the horror of Garfield on the internet was going to truly solidify, it needed an aesthetic, and in the following year, it would get it. In 2018, an image would be uploaded to Instagram from horror artist Will Burke, one that depicted a horrifyingly bloated Garfield clutching a tiny, frightened John with the text,
John, I require lasagna.
Something about this image resonated with people, and it became wildly popular online, becoming the first in a series of 5 illustrations, each one depicting Garfield as a grotesque, swollen monstrosity, his form swimming between heaving mounds of flesh and sharp insect-like appendages as he hunted John through his home. And while the sheer horror of seeing Garfield twisted into such nightmarish forms were a huge part of the power of these images, critically, they also captured the kind of hopelessness of the character of John Arbuckle, but channeled it into pure horror. One illustration showing John terrified and clutching a shotgun as a grotesque centipede-like Garfield emerges through the door behind him, with text that reads,
"Bullets don't work, John."
The final image of this series depicting a gargantuan Garfield now towering over a helpless, terrified John as he whispers,
"The world is going to end, John."
These images would rampage across the internet, being posted, reposted, and upvoted tens of thousands of times, and would become the blueprint for everything Garfield would become online. As different artists began to create their own interpretations of Burke's work, such as animator Lumpy Touch, who took Burke's illustrations and reimagined them through stunning and horrifying pixel art animations, not only giving these still images a new horrifying dimension to the movements, but also reframing them as a 2D survival horror video game. Lumpy Touch taking this concept even further later on, with both a first-person exploration recreation of the original I'm Sorry John comic, as well as creating a tutorial for his own fake Garfield survival horror game in which the player is hunted by one of 13 Gorefields, all based on the different zodiac signs. And what I really love about this is you can see that kind of existential horror introduced by Gramfell, as well as the more grotesque body horror introduced by Burke, now being spliced with other mediums and genres of horror, and you could see this continue to evolve in other illustrations like those of artist Omega Black, who took the idea of Garfield horror and introduced a cosmic eldritch feel, like this image in which Garfield states,
"I no longer require eyes, John."
Which I am pretty sure is a reference to the 1997 film Event Horizon, a sci-fi horror in which a group of astronauts board a lost starship that has returned from hell, featuring the infamous line,
"Where we're going, we won't need eyes to see."
Omega Black's other illustrations only expanding on this Lovecraftian style of Garfield horror, with a grotesque centipede-like Garfield stating,
"Heaven is a void of light, John."
Or John being held captive by cloaked Odies before an impossibly massive multi-armed Garfield booms,
"I'm eternal, John."
Each new piece of Garfield fan art added to this idea of Garfield as a cosmic, horrifying being, sometimes referred to as Creepy Garfield or Gorefield. And this is what led to October 8th, 2018, and the creation of the subreddit r/I'm Sorry John. There's nearly a cult-like feel to I'm Sorry John. Its title plaque reading, "Garfield has abandoned his limited form and he is beautiful. Surrender yourself to him and be saved." This is a community of nearly 800,000 people dedicated to bringing to life this new version of Garfield the internet has created, as well as his infinite torment of John Arbuckle. And maybe, like I did, you're thinking, no, Garfield's not evil. He's not trying to hurt
John, it's not like that mystery number 2 category of Garfield joke is in fact humor based off Garfield's torment of John. But that's right, at 18.8%, nearly 1 in 5 Garfield jokes center around Garfield causing John mental anguish. And it's not just that. Another variable I measured for was the amount of times Garfield showed empathy towards John.
Das war aber ein langes Comeback. Und wir wollen mal festhalten, Kategorie 2 ist, wie er John Ärger bereitet oder den Wahnsinn treibt. Und Kategorie 1 ist, wie John einfach belanglos ist. Und wie sich Garfield über Johns Belanglosigkeit lustig macht. Also wenn man Kategorie 1 und 2 zusammenfasst, holy shit, was für ein Psycho-Comic. Und das sind die Original-Comics, das sind die Original-Comic-Strips, nicht die nachgemachten oder nicht diese Horror-Dinger jetzt, sondern das sind die originalen Comics. Puh.
Or tried to comfort his suffering in any way. And across nearly 1,000 comics, that number was 0. So, in the same way Garfield minus Garfield reveals something real, if unintentional, about Garfield, the same is true in I'm Sorry, John. Garfield has always been about a person trapped with a cold, nihilistic being that
Garfield ist ein Huhn. So.
Torments him, and it's been that way for 40 years. And all that I'm Sorry, John does is bring that concept to a horrifying extreme.
Und jetzt denk mal an die Katze mit dem Namen drüber, ja? Warum ich da vielleicht einmal ein bisschen streng reagiert habe. Nur einmal ganz kurz, ja? Jetzt denk mal bitte darüber nach.
This is the reason I think so many pieces on I'm Sorry, John have this odd kind of power to them. Their horror is rooted in being trapped with something awful and inescapable. But what's really fascinating about the horror of I'm Sorry, John is how different artists have approached this idea in different ways. I like categorizing things, so I've identified what I think are 3 basic kinds of horror on I'm Sorry, John. The first being physical Garfield horror. These are pieces that twist Garfield into strange and frightening creatures, sometimes into amalgamations of unsettling body horror, but more often swelling Garfield to such nightmarish proportions that there is no chance of John ever defeating, escaping, or even surviving these grotesque beasts Garfield has become. And what's interesting here is how many of these pieces evoke or even directly reference the FromSoft games Dark Souls and Bloodborne, which themselves create a lot of their horror and emotion by forcing you into battles with these massive and horrifying creatures that feel impossible to overcome. It's that kind of physical hopelessness that these pieces create. And just like those games, the more extreme examples of this kind of Garfield horror carry a cosmic, nearly Lovecraftian feel, as Garfield is now so large, so impossible, that he begins to feel like some kind of terrible deity, a being of such immense power and scale that it throws into chaos our own sense of humanity's place in the universe. Whether we really are the dominant species we've always assumed, or just dust in the wake of something much greater. I just read that line and I can't believe we're talking about fucking Garfield. The second type of Garfield horror is more intimate and psychological. Here, it's less that Garfield is a physical threat as much as it is the subtle, insidious damage he's doing to John's mental state, sometimes in the form of an awful, malicious creature who constantly follows John and goads him, driving him to do terrible things, but sometimes as a delusional presence in John's own mind, a manifestation of his internal struggles, be they depression, addiction, or worse, in a way that feels similar to your Shinings, your Silent Hills, or reading your own comment section. These pieces are much rarer, but what I think's awesome about them is how they take that bleakness that's always pieces are much
Entschuldigung, da kann ich ruhig auf Pause machen. Bei den anderen habe ich mich nicht getraut, auf Pause zu machen. Hier kann ich ruhig auf. Das ist ein sehr tiefes Rabbit Hole. Alter, das ist einfach so ein mieses Rabbit Hole.
Rarer, but what I think's awesome about them is how they take that bleakness that's always been a part of John's character and express it through Garfield. There is a third type of Garfield horror, and these are my personal favorite. Posts that focus on a more existential form of terror. The simplest examples of this are pieces that trap John in these impossible and infinite liminal spaces where there is no escape and he will forever be haunted by Garfield. But other scenarios are more elaborate, like when even death itself can't release John from Garfield's grasp, showing Garfield as this immortal, unending being who will always return to plague John, or even the opposite, like in this one comic where John takes his own life to escape Garfield, only to be brought back to life by him so his suffering can continue. Other pieces are stranger and even more abstract, like showing Garfield as these grotesque physical parasites that have attached themselves. Garfield as these grotesque physical parasites.
You know, I'm really glad I'm me, Garfield. Das hat auch so mies. Boah. Junge, meine Katze hat gerade die Tür aufgemacht. Ich bin so dead.
That have attached.
Oh, der Odi links. Der Odi, oh, das ist alles so übel einfach.
Themselves to John and are feeding off him, while he is trapped in these strange, unending dream worlds. And I think where this particular kind of horror gets really powerful is when it's combined with the more psychological type of Garfield horror we just talked about, like Lumpy Touch's Relax John, which we mentioned earlier. And what I think is so great about this animation is it shows John returning home late one night at his most broken, his life now destroyed, having lost his job, Liz, and even Odie. And it's at this point when he's at his absolute lowest that he is most vulnerable to a being like Garfield, who offers John an escape from his miserable existence in the form of comfort, but in reality drags him into a frightening nightmare. And I love this so much because it is such a fantastic example of what Garfield has become on the internet. Garfield is despair. He's the part of John that makes him feel weak and insignificant, who pulls him down and traps him in realities dark and frightening. That is the core horror of Garfield and I'm Sorry, John. It's interesting to note that this concept has only continued to evolve online, in subcommunities like You're Welcome.
Oh Gott, ich weiß nicht, was ich hier alles sehend bin. Es tut mir so leid, Entschuldigung. Ihr seid jetzt alle verdorben, es tut mir leid.
John, which is a more wholesome, if still very disturbing relationship between John and a cosmically nightmarish Garfield, as well as I'm really sorry, John, which I cannot even talk about if this video has any hope of staying monetized. Hey, oh God, by the way, this video is nearly definitely going to be demonetized, and so I have a Patreon. There's one tier, it's $1, so yeah. But hey, look, either way, I appreciate you watching. You can even see this very defined kind of Garfield.
Hey, das war aber Krümelmonster, oder? Warte mal.
Either way, I appreciate you watching. You can even see this.
Das sieht eher aus wie Krümelmonster, nicht wie Garfield, oder? Und isst auch Kekse. Das ist nicht Garfield. Hä?
Very defined kind of Garfield horror being transplanted onto other fictional series with I'm Sorry John's occasional non-Garfield weekends. And while
Garfield war unten. Ich muss noch mal ganz kurz, Entschuldigung. Oh, hinter den Untertiteln. Die Kekse sind in Garfield. Sehe ich das richtig? Die Kekse sind in Garfield? Oh. Ah, ja, gut. In Other Series. Jetzt verstehe ich das. Okay. Fandoms, die sich überlappen. Okay, verstehe. Ja. Ah.
Defined kind of Garfield horror.
Und hier auch The Office quasi, ja, verstehe.
Are being transplanted onto other fictional series with I'm Sorry John's occasional non-Garfield weekends. And while I really love these pieces...
I'm Really Sorry John's auf Reddit gebannt. Oh, okay. Vielleicht gut, ich weiß es nicht genau. Wird wohl seine Gründe haben.
Ernie, how do I look? With your eyes burnt. With your eyes.
God, that's so good. I think it's interesting how, at least to me, they never quite carry the same level of impact or meaning as those based on Garfield. Not only because of how deeply rooted the horror of I'm Sorry John is in the very core of Garfield, but also in how, when taken with everything else we've talked about today, these pieces begin to transform what these characters are, and in particular, John Arbuckle. When I started this video, all John was this schlubby dude, but over time, that started to change. I watched him go from this character with a very defined purpose and reason for existing to someone who loses that purpose and becomes to the world around them a pathetic joke. And it's like that experience causes this deep emptiness to well up inside them, a despair that makes life feel meaningless and impossible in a way that the Garfield comic can barely contain. Till one day, that despair begins to manifest as Garfield, an entity that traps John in this deep and horrifying delusion, warping every part of his reality. This entity, with each passing day, growing stronger and more frightening as John falls deeper into despair. And when I think of this late stage of John's existence, there's one artist in particular that comes to mind. Part of what makes Rojam's work so powerful and frightening is how intimately they seem to understand each particular kind of Garfield horror. Some pieces show Garfield as these massive, monstrous beasts whose mere existence conveys this horrifying physical futility. Others show Garfield as this gargantuan and grotesque parasite, as this insidious force that's been with John since the moment he was born, and for years has manipulated and contorted every part of his life.
Oh, jetzt sehe ich das. I love you too, John. Und hier die Fäden einfach. Die Fäden hier oben.
John.
Ist schon sehr geil. Boah. Artists sind so krass eigentlich.
Until finally, Garfield has grown so powerful that he's now more a god than anything else. So infinite, cosmic, and terrifying that he's become John's entire reality. And John, now just a speck of dust, hopeless and terrified in the face of this thing that he created till the end of time.
And I think...
Ganz kurz, ich weiß, wie es euch geht. Nehmen wir mal, wir haben vorhin über South Park gequatscht. Und bei South Park gab es ja zwischendurch diese eine Realfolge. Und es gab auch diese Anime-Folge früher, falls ihr euch noch dran erinnert. Und das war einfach so geil zu sehen, dass die Serie zu sehen, wie die einfach mit einem anderen Stil dargestellt ist, einfach so komplett. Das war so geil. Und das hier spielte aber auch alles rein, dass man aus dieser einen Serie plötzlich ganz andere Dinge ableitet, so abstrahiert und so weiter. Und was für krassen Shit man daraus machen kann. Manches ist fragwürdig, was wir hier gesehen haben vielleicht, aber da sind halt teilweise richtig geile Sachen dabei. Kennst du Berserk? Da steht's. Ich weiß nicht, ob man das sieht. Da sind die Bände. Ja. Die Zeichnung erinnert mich auch ein bisschen daran, hast du recht. Aber das ist halt, ne, also sowas finde ich immer geil, wenn Sachen bei mir gerade so aus der Popkultur in andere, nicht Medien übertragen werden, sondern einfach anders stilistisch dargestellt werden, abstrahiert werden und so weiter. Und natürlich auch crossovert werden mit anderen Sachen und so. Das ist schon geil.
I think there's something really powerful about these images. The beautiful thing about horror is it lets us externalize the things that haunt us. And when I look at the work of Omega Black or Lumpy Touch or Rajam, what I see is a person struggling.
Don't forget the Lasagna, John.
Someone whose existence...
Das funktioniert nur, weil Garfield jeder kennt. Ich sage ja mit allen Teilen der Popkultur. Ja, also ist egal, es kann auch One Piece sein. Es funktioniert mit vielen Teilen der Popkultur. Etwas, was für dich, womit du natürlich was zu tun hast, würde dich mehr interessieren als Teile, womit du gar nichts zu tun hast. Das ist ja klar.
Stopped making sense a long time ago and who's just trapped in this horrifying distortion of what their life should be. And I think there's something very human about that. When I think back to the very worst periods of my life, what comes to me is this feeling of being trapped in my own mind, that there is something in me that is distorting how I see the world and the people around me and everything, and it's horrible. It's a nightmare. And I think the hardest part of it is the feeling that it's never going to end, that the way you feel in those moments is how you will feel for the rest of your life.
Oh ja, das kenne ich.
And if you've ever struggled mentally or emotionally, you know that fear. And it is that fear that I've never seen visualized better than in fucking Garfield fan art. We all want to be Garfield, but we all are John Arbuckle.
Ich möchte noch mal ganz kurz darauf hinweisen, die Sachen, die wir von John sehen, ja, sind sehr komprimiert in die Comicstrips. Ja, also jeder von uns hat seine Phasen mit Trauer, mit Wut, mit Hilflosigkeit, aber auch mit Glück. Ja, also jeder von uns hat seine Phasen. Ich glaube, das betrifft einfach jeden von uns. Ja, wir sind alle John, aber so ist das Leben. Das Leben besteht nicht immer nur aus Trauer und Wut, ja, auch wenn es dir manchmal so vorkommt vielleicht, dass du gerade so eine Phase hast, aber natürlich wird es auch wieder anders. Ich habe von diesen Phasen sehr viele Ups und Downs gehabt. Sehr viele. Bis ich mich irgendwann, vielleicht, ich weiß nicht, ja, irgendwann habe ich angefangen, ich habe immer noch diesen gewissen Selbsthass, ja, den habe ich immer noch, weil ich mir für vieles, das ist so ein Kindheitsding, so aus der Kindheit, aber ich habe irgendwann angefangen, mich selbst und auch meine Eigenarten und viele, viele Dinge von mir selbst zu akzeptieren, für mich. Und das ist das Wichtigste. Ja, du suchst Akzeptanz bei anderen, aber das Wichtige ist eigentlich, dass du selber deine eigenen Sachen akzeptierst. Und das habe ich auch, es fing bei mir relativ spät an. Relativ spät. Wobei ich aber generell glaube, dass ich immer 10 Jahre hinterher hänge, vom Mindset her. Geht einigen von euch vielleicht auch so, aber bei mir sind es ungefähr roughly so 10 Jahre, die ich hinterher hänge. Aber hat lange gedauert und das heißt auch nicht, dass ich nicht trotzdem nochmal traurig bin, dass ich nicht trotzdem nochmal unglücklich bin, deprimiert, ne, so depressive Phase oder so. Das kann immer nochmal auftauchen, aber ich kann es inzwischen wesentlich besser einordnen. Also ich kann für mich damit wesentlich besser umgehen inzwischen, weil ich mich in diesen Jahren, die ich jetzt auf der Welt bin, halt auch wesentlich länger, ich hatte wesentlich mehr Zeit, mich kennenzulernen und selbst zu reflektieren. So, also ja, vielleicht sind wir alle John Arbuckle, aber das sind alles immer Fragmente. Das sind alles immer nur Fragmente. Deswegen darf man da jetzt auch nicht zu viel reininterpretieren, sondern das ist eben das Leben. Was soll ich euch sagen? Nach 90 Jahren wird es Zeit. Schnauz jetzt.
And the thing is, those bad times, they do never last.
Ja, das stimmt.
They do end. And I think that's why I find this final piece so hopeful. The piece is done in Rajam's traditional pen and ink style, but with a subtlety that makes it feel nearly carved from stone. And it shows a demonic Garfield lying, defeated and broken, a sandaled foot pinning him to the ground, which belongs to an angelic John Arbuckle. Tears rolling down his face, his wings raised in this just glorious arc. And it's like, after everything we've watched John go through, after all the loneliness, the depression, the complete loss of his identity, leading to the dissolution of his reality into this infinite, abject nightmare, after all that, somehow, he's made it to this moment.
he's taken his life back from the shit that haunts him, and it's fucking beautiful.
Alter, das Bild, ne? Boah.
And maybe this won't last.
Es ist ein Fanart zu Garfield. Ich möchte das mal kurz sagen.
Maybe.
Aber er sieht aus wie Michelangelo
there's
einfach.
still
So, what
darker
the
times
fuck?
ahead. But it doesn't matter. Because in this moment, he's okay.
Er hat seine Katze getötet, kriegt nicht mal ein Achievement dafür. Hört auf jetzt! Leute, hört jetzt auf damit! Wir müssen das hinter uns
John's
lassen.
okay. And look, I get it. I
Das
get that
Bild ist
having
Gronkh.
this strong and emotional.
So war das nämlich. So war das nämlich. Die Katze hatte einen Namen und jetzt ist sie weg und so war das nämlich. Original, das ist es gewesen, Leute. So.
Reaction to what is most certainly
Und seitdem weiß ich, wer ich bin.
Shitpost
Seitdem weiß ich.
is ridiculous. But goddamn, that is what I do here. I take my hope where I can get it.
Porsuk ist polnisch für Garfield.
The title of this piece being The Forgiveness of John.
Oh,
Jetzt, was? Jetzt mach das Bild doch nicht so schnell weg. Was ist denn mit
The
dir?
Forgiveness.
The Forgiveness of John. Alter, was für ein geiles Bild. Auch hier mit diesen Rändern, diesen Regenwürmern. Alter. Und hier die Hände, die nach Garfield greifen und so, die Gesichter. Heilige Scheiße. Boah. So Forgiment. Da ist schon.
Of John.
Oh, I put the costume back on because I was worried that this part might be too heavy
Verstehe ich,
without
ja.
it, and also I paid a lot of money for it.
What makes The Forgiveness of John so powerful to me is that in isolation, it is an amazing piece of art and a real technical achievement. But when taken with everything else we've spoken about this video, it becomes the concluding chapter of a gigantic meta-narrative that is formed around John Arbuckle. And again, if I was the only person who saw that, there wouldn't be a story here. The Forgiveness of John being the third most popular post on r/I'm sorry John of all time, as well as adorning its front page. And I think it's awesome that so many people's individual works come together to pull such an incredible
Das Bild hat
story.
32 Stunden
Something
gedauert.
as simple as a
Das ist ziemlich wenig dafür,
comic
finde ich.
strip
Ich will das auch
about
als
a cat
Poster.
who likes
Voll geil.
lasagna. This is what I love about fandoms. When you stare at them for long enough, these beautiful and strange stories start to emerge that are distorted and honest and amazing. And whatever else you want to say about the nightmare of the modern day internet and social media, I'm glad that those stories have a place to exist.
Vielleicht ganz kurz nochmal, weil ich öfter gelesen habe, ne, weil die Bilder sind ja sehr, sehr dark, ja, also sehr, sehr dunkel teilweise. Und Leute das dann teilweise auch mit sich selbst ein bisschen assoziiert haben oder vielleicht mit eigenen Ängsten und Depressionen und Gemütszuständen. Diese Bilder, die da gezeichnet wurden, vielleicht kann man das ein bisschen daraus ableiten für sich selbst, die wurden ja auch von jemandem gezeichnet und wahrscheinlich auch von Leuten, die eventuell einiges im Leben erlebt oder durchgemacht haben, sodass sie sich eben zum Beispiel so einer Kunst zugewandt haben oder solche Bilder gemalt haben. Das heißt, im Grunde genommen zeigen diese Bilder, dass egal, was du eventuell hast, egal, was du durchmachst, viele Leute und mehr als du denkst, wahrscheinlich auch viele in deinem Umfeld, machen genau das Gleiche durch. Vielleicht aus anderen Gründen, sehr wahrscheinlich aus anderen Gründen, vielleicht andere Geschichten, aber es geht sehr, sehr vielen Menschen ähnlich. Sehr, sehr vielen Menschen. Und das sollte man vielleicht eher daraus mitnehmen. Als die düsteren Bilder an sich sollte man vielleicht eher daran denken, woher die kommen. Und dass Leute damit wahrscheinlich auch, und ich weiß nicht, ob ihr das vielleicht macht, Leute schreiben Tagebücher, Leute schreiben Songtexte, Leute malen Bilder, Leute versuchen diese Gedanken irgendwie zu Papier zu bringen, irgendwie aus ihrem Kopf rauszukriegen, irgendwie vielleicht in die Welt zu schreien ohne sie anderen mitzuteilen, ohne dass andere wissen, was in ihnen vorgeht, sondern sich einfach nur so auszudrücken, weil manchmal, und das kenne ich von mir selbst, manchmal hast du nicht die Möglichkeit, dich auszudrücken. Manchmal kannst du nicht sagen, was in dir vorgeht. Manchmal hast du vielleicht nicht die Worte dafür. Und dann versuchst du es zumindest irgendwie aus dir rauszukriegen. Und das kann man vielleicht aus den Bildern mitnehmen. Dass es einfach vielen, vielen anderen Leuten auch so geht. Mehr als man denkt. So wie HR Geiger. Ja, HR Giga, Entschuldigung. Ja,
I think that's pretty cool.
Oh.
Friends, thank you for joining me today, and I really hope you enjoyed this video.
Da waren wir genau am Ende.
Huge thank you to artist
Da waren wir
Lumpy
genau am
Touch
Ende. Genau,
who did the
verarbeiten. Das
incredible thumbnail
einfach
for this
verarbeiten.
video.